So welcome. I'm glad everybody could make it today. This is a great crowd. I just want to ask first off, how many of you are here for the Common Ground Conference? Okay, good. I'm glad the word reached you about this. That's great. My name is Celia Bavier, and I'm the Executive Director of the Border Community Alliance, which is technically based in Tubac, but it really just is our office because we do work across the southern Arizona and northern Mexico border. And I'll tell you a little bit about us in just a minute. First, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, the restrooms, there's some this way, if you go out this door to the left, and then there's some in the back if you go out and to the left. So 2 sets of restrooms. We also have a few sandwiches back there. If anybody is still hungry, help yourselves. First of all, I want to welcome our in-person folks, you all, but also our people on Zoom. We have people on Zoom from across the country here today, so I want to welcome all of you, whether you're here or joining us online. And I'd like to start off with thanking our host today, the United Methodist Church of Green Valley. Their minister's not here, but I think Don and Jerry and some other folks associated with the church are here. So if you want to find out more about that church, you should talk to them afterward. But this church has been a wonderful partner for us throughout the years in terms of volunteers, hosting events, funding, pretty much everything. So we're just incredibly grateful for this church and their support for us and for Borderlands cross-border alliances. I also wanted to thank our sponsors. We have several co-sponsors with us today. First of all, FASAC, which is our community foundation partner in Nogales, and I will have Alma, who's the director, come up in a minute and tell you a little bit about FASAC. But they are our key partner in Nogales, Sonora. That helps us to do our tours, our social investment work, our internship program, so many things. So I want to thank them for collaborating today. I also want to thank Voices from the Border, which is a Patagonia and Nogales, Sonora-based nonprofit, which provides housing for migrants waiting to cross over for their appointments. And I want to thank the Greater Green Valley Community Foundation, which has offices here and also in Green Valley. Michelle Phillips is their longtime executive director. She unfortunately could not be here today, but she extends her thanks for coming and her good wishes. So we're so grateful for these 3 partners today to make this event happen. So I'm going to just tell you a couple things about BCA, and then we'll move forward with the program. Border Community Alliance is a now 11-year-old nonprofit. We've been doing cross-border work in the form of our educational programs, such as forums such as this, tours to Nogales, Sonora, and all throughout Mexico. Right now, we actually have a tour group in Mexico City. We go to Mata Ortiz right now, Kino Bay, and where else, Ann, am I missing? Rio Sonora. We went to Rio Sonora this year. So we're always Oaxaca. We're going to go to Oaxaca in March. So we always have new tours going on, and if you're interested, reach out to one of us, or we have information on the table in the back or on our website. So we've been doing educational programming, cultural exchange, and social investment work for 11 years, actually 11 plus years. And our social investment work brings us into the topic that we're talking about today, which is that we work with several different migrant shelters in Nogales, Sonora through our community foundation partner, and also just across the border in Agua Prieta and Sonoita as well. And then we support about 25 different nonprofits that are doing all sorts of work in different areas, from elderly programs to Down syndrome to foster care. So we kind of run the gamut in terms of our social investment work. And if you're interested in that, you can talk to me afterward, and I'm happy to tell you more about that. So we also have a Borderlands Ambassador program where we bring 6 college-age students here over the summer to live in the Borderlands and explore both sides. And we have a Spanish language program, a Borderlands literature and film circle, and other things, which I won't go into everything today. But that just gives you a sort of a excerpt of what we do for those of you who aren't familiar with us, especially if you're from out of town. So now I just want to invite quickly up Alma. There she is, who's from FASAC is our community foundation partner. Alma has been with them now. Yesterday was her 22nd anniversary with FASAC. So I'm going to let her talk about FASAC for a minute.
Thank you, everyone. First of all, for opening your eyes and your ears to what could happen, to what might be next. FASAC, we work as a community foundation. In Mexico, there are 19 of us versus the thousands in the States and in Europe, so it's kind of a new model. The model of a community foundation in Mexico is 25 years old. We were part of the funding group in Mexico. So regarding the topic for today, FASAC has been working with the shelters, with the initiatives like Kino Board initiative that most of you might know about. We have worked with them before they arrived in Nogales. We have worked with the latest organization that was created 4 years ago during the pandemic. And just for you to know, and those of you who have been supporters through BCA, the school program, the education program that started within Casa de la Misericordia is the only school in Mexico, the only school in the country recognized as a public school. The public school system is not putting a penny into it, but they are supporting us through the grade reports, documents that they have to provide for the kids once they start their asylum process and decide how to enroll in school, etc. But being recognized as a public school, hiring local teachers that had just graduated from college, it's a big plus. So we feel very, very proud of that effort of including, everyone can provide, food, shelter, healthcare in some areas, but providing a full-time school program for kids that have never been in school, some of them. Most of the kids that are under 8, this is their first desk, this is their first teacher, this is their first iPad, because they have been out of school since the pandemic, then their traveling journey as a migrant family, etc. So supporting that kind of initiative, that's what we call social investment versus a pure charity-oriented program. So thank you for being here today.
Okay, and I just wanted to recognize a couple people that are here. First of all, BCA's board president, Jose Lopez. Can you stand or raise your hand? Thanks. Hi, there's Jose. And Jerry Haas, who's our senior advisor in the back. And Bob Phillips, who's the FASAC senior advisor. Where are you, Bob? There he is. Okay. Okay. Any other BCA board members here that I didn't see? Okay, I think some of them are on Zoom, so great. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of the structure that we're going to follow today, and then I will introduce Alyson. So she's going to talk for 45 or 50 minutes or so, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience here, our in-person audience. I have a microphone, and I'll go around, so please wait for me to get to you with the microphone. For the folks on Zoom, we're not able to answer your questions directly today, but Alyson has generally offered that you can email her, and I think your email's in the chat, and it'll be on the last slide. You can email her after this or during the presentation to ask your questions afterward. So that will be our structure. So I'm now going to introduce Alyson. So Alyson is a good friend of mine. She has the wonderful, lifestyle that many of us have here of living in 2 different states. So she has the Borderlands perspective through living here in Green Valley and being able to live here in the Borderlands. And then she also lives in Virginia, Charlottesville, Virginia part-time. So she kind of has that sort of East Coast experience too with particularly the immigration topic that we're going to speak about today. So she is she's had a career before she retired in corporate marketing and international strategy, and she also worked as a microfinance troubleshooter, both in Africa and Central Asia. Right now, she serves on the Community Development Committee of the International Rescue Committee in Central Virginia. So Alyson is probably the best researcher I know in terms of just really digging down into the facts and the meat and, not the media perceptions and opinions, but just getting down to what's really happening, which I think is, there's just a sore lack of that, really. A lot of us just look at the headlines and we don't kind of bother to dig deeper, which is what we really all need to do. But Alyson did it for us. So we're lucky to have her here today. So she's been researching immigration for quite a few years now and doing presentations across the country about this topic. She's always up to date and does her research. So I'm just really excited that Alyson agreed to join us today, and here she is.
Thanks a lot, Celia, and thank you all for being here today. And I was looking on my calendar, Celia, for what was the exact date when we decided I would do this presentation. It was 6 weeks ago today that we decided this topic might be of interest to a few people. So I'm thrilled that you're here with me this afternoon, and I'm really excited that there are also people online watching the presentation. I'd like to give a special thanks to Chad, who is the technician here at the church. He's done such a great job of organizing the technology here and preparing us. So without him, we wouldn't be here. So thanks, Chad. I have about 15 slides, and we have about 45 minutes for me to go through those slides. So it's going to go quite quickly, and some of these have a lot of details, so I'll go very slowly through each slide. But here's the agenda for today. I'm going to start with some background. Those of you who've heard me speak before know that it's very important that you think of this holistically. What is the big picture of what's going on? So we're going to talk background about the narratives that we're hearing. We're going to talk some population trends in the U.S., and we're going to talk about some U.S. immigration laws and what our immigration system looks like, and also what's the economic impact of those immigrants. Then we're going to turn to what's going to happen here in the next few weeks. So let's start with narratives. For anybody who was living in the States during the recent campaign, you probably heard these kinds of narratives. You probably heard Americans should be scared. We have a big invasion. We're witnessing people coming that are murderers and rapists. They're taking our jobs. They're taking our social services money. They're bringing drugs into the country, and they're lowering our wages. So this is the dominant narrative. Now, there's a couple things that I find interesting about this narrative. One is that this is a typical narrative that Americans have used throughout history whenever a new wave of migrants was coming into the country. This is a very typical narrative. Two, that this is a similar narrative that's being heard all over the world right now in various places to varying degrees. These are the same arguments that are being used all over the world when new people are arriving in those countries. And the third interesting thing to me is that this narrative is really the underpinning of what's going on in the United States today. Because it's such a dominant narrative, and it's relatively new. It wasn't as dominant a year ago as it is now, but it was made dominant in the last few months. And what that does is it enables whatever happens going forward to happen. We have created a situation where if you really believe these things, and a lot of Americans do believe that we are being invaded by murderers and rapists, when bad things happen to those people, we won't be so concerned about them. Now I'm going to zero in on just one piece here right now, which is the murderers and the rapists. We're going to talk about crime a little bit later in the conversation, but I just want to point out that this one in particular is not correct. That in fact, if you look, and studies have been done, and if you compare the unauthorized here, the people without the proper papers, and you compare those people to the people who are native-borns, like myself, you'd find that on average, those undocumented or unauthorized people had committed less crimes than the native-borns. And that's a fact, and that you can see in several studies that have been done. So let's take a look at a different kind of narrative, one that's maybe a little bit more closely associated with reality, because the studies that I've done and the research that I've done tells me that this narrative is incorrect. But let's look at an alternative narrative here. The reality really is more like this. Americans should be proud of the opportunity to welcome hardworking men and women and their young children who create more jobs, contribute to our social services, and that drugs enter our country by truck at the ports of entry, not with these people who are coming across the border, not with the unauthorized or the newly asylum seekers, and that our low wages come from automation, offshoring, and no minimum wages, not from the competition that these people are bringing. So that's the first piece of our background. Let's turn to another trend which is important when we talk about immigration, and that's our population trends. If you just stick with me for a minute on the title, actual of 1.7 is less than 2.1 replacement rate. And what does this mean? Maybe you've read something about this. Start on the right. The replacement rate of 2.1 means that if, on average, every woman in our society had 2.1 children, we would replace our population exactly. Right? They're about half the population, and if we had just a little bit more than 2, we'd have, for people that might die young, we could replace our population. Right now, the U.S. is actually at 1.7. We're not replacing our population. Now, what does that mean to an economy? It took me a while to sort through what that meant. Let's just look at the local situation of a small town. If we know that the actual rate of population growth was not at the replacement rate, what happens? In that town, as the population shrinks, fewer and fewer can pay taxes, right? And we know that our education is paid for by our local taxes. So what happens? The schools, maybe they would have three third grade classes, but as the population shrinks, at some point they have to go down to 2 third grade classes. But they tend not to do that as quickly as they might need to based on the taxes that they're collecting. So they start to go into debt, and schools and infrastructures start to overspend until that little town decides either to take on debt or to reduce their number of classrooms. They get into a little bit of a downward spiral because the population is less than the replacement rate, unless they bring in more people from the outside to live in the town and pay those taxes. So that's just what happens on the local level. Now let's look at the national level. At the national level, we know that we have an elderly population. Right now, there are more people in our age group, in the retired age groups, than there are in the working populations coming up through the system. We have an elderly population. We need more elder care here. We also know, and I didn't realize this statistics till I started studying recently, we have over 7 million jobs right now in the U.S., over 7 million open jobs in the U.S. People want to hire, but they can't. That's a lot of people we need to work. We need people from the outside to fill those jobs because we're not replacing them with our own people. And when we look at the global picture, we see this again repeated. We find that many other countries have this same problem. They have a lower actual birth rate than they do a replacement rate. Recently, I was on a conference call with people from Europe, from Australia, and from Canada. And they were all of those groups were actively working at programs to encourage more people and more migrants to come to their country because they knew that they had less actual people in their population than their replacement rate. And they were trying to make up the difference by attracting more and more people to them. So this is the competition that we have. So this is the background, not just the narrative, but the U.S. population trends. This is the background for our discussion today about immigration. Those of you who have heard me talk before have seen this slide before. You know that our law is a very vast law. It's about 1,000 pages long, this immigration law that we live with now. It was passed in 1965, so it's quite outdated, but we really haven't in Congress been able to upgrade that. We have about 186 different visas that we use to allow people to come into the country. On the left in this chart, you'll see people who have pathways to citizenship. On the right, we have people who don't have pathways to citizenship. We know that mostly people come here with family visas. These are children of people who are living here, or they are spouses or parents of people who are living here, either as citizens or green card holders. We have a number of work visas. We have humanitarian visas, and those are people like refugees or asylum seekers. Now, with the exception of the asylum seekers on this left-hand side on this chart, all these people are vetted overseas. They talk to our State Department. They're given medical exams. They are thoroughly vetted before they even arrive. The asylum seekers are people who come to our southern border and they seek asylum. They must have been persecuted in their home country based on race or religion or a number of other reasons. It's a very narrow and a very specific law. So recently, when we saw people being bused from Texas up to, say, New York City or Martha's Vineyard, flown in up there from Florida, these were asylum seekers. They were all here legally, and they all, unfortunately, by law, could not work for 6 months. So the snag came when they arrived, and they were bused or flown up to a city in the Northeast, but they couldn't start working even though they wanted to. But those people were all here legally based on our system. They all came in with asylum visas, and then eventually anybody on that left side could convert their original visa to a green card, and if they want, at their option, they could convert to become a citizen or not. That would be up to them. Now let's go to the right side of that chart, no pathways to citizenship. A number of those are temporary visas. These are people who come here for the university, people who come here to work temporarily. You may have heard of the H-2A visa, the agricultural visa. People who pick our strawberries are in this group. The H-2B visas are the specialty workers, people who trim the vines in a vineyard. This is a specialty job category. Or the H-1Bs. We'll talk about the H-1Bs later. This has been in the news recently. These are the high-tech medical or computer folks who are coming in as temporary workers to be in the U.S. Now, the three that are listed on the right-hand side at the bottom there, the DACA, the temporary protected, and the humanitarian parole, these are what I call the workarounds. These are situations, these are not visas, but these are permissions to stay in the country temporarily. You may know DACA as the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, young people who've come here from overseas, probably with their parents, as children. They've grown up here, they're not citizens, and President Obama several years ago started DACA. It's been very controversial. It's been in the courts. There's still a court case pending whether it's lawful for this to have even been created. But right now there are about 600,000 people who are living as DACA recipients, which allows them to work and get driver's licenses, but there's no pathway to citizenship for them. And they must renew that permission every 2 to 3 years. So that's something that's ongoing. There are about 600,000 people. About 75% of those are Mexicans, but the other 25 come from about 100 different countries in that DACA category. The temporary protected status has been around since about 1980, and there are about 17 different countries that are allowed to stay here as they're given permission by the president to stay here as a group based on either a war or some natural disaster that doesn't allow them to return home. So the big categories would be El Salvador. We have Haitians here in temporary protected status, but like I said, about 17 different countries. And in this category, there are about 800,000 people, temporary protected status, that will all expire over the next, say, 18 months. They're generally given about 18 months to stay, and that's renewed time and again. 18 months, you can stay for 18 months more. We're not sure where that will go in the future. And then humanitarian parole is the third category that I call workaround. Humanitarian parole is generally used for a short-term entry into the U.S. You need to have a doctor's appointment or a big operation. You're given 1 month to come in with your mother because you're a child, and you come in and you are in the hospital for a few weeks, and so you're given just a temporary entry visa. And this was used quite a bit by the Biden administration to allow people to come from a number of countries like Haiti, Venezuela, Nicaragua. Some of the Afghans came on humanitarian parole because they weren't allowed in with the special immigrant visa, which is what they'd hoped. So this was a workaround for them. Some of the Ukrainians came with humanitarian parole. So that's just a quick overview of our immigration system in general. And again, some have pathways to citizenship and others do not have pathways to citizenship, but they're given temporary times to be here. Now let's take a look at what the benefits of those immigrants are to us and our system. Before COVID, so before in a typical year, and in fact I think Biden actually ramped up to about 1 million a year, we brought in about 1 million people a year and made them citizens. Those lists on the right, in all categories, family visa most of all, a few work visas, and some humanitarian visas. Those were the main categories of visas. Why is this important? Well, we brought in more workers. Remember our 7 million jobs that are open. So every year, taking in 1 million immigrants in this manner allowed us to keep our growth rate up in our economy, and it gave us more people to pay more taxes, to contribute to social services like Social Security, and they also spent money in our economy. So given that we were bringing these people in, our economy was growing as a result. The second phenomenon about immigrants is very interesting to me, that new businesses are the ones that create jobs for us in our economy, and these immigrants tend to be more creative than the native-borns. There's a statistic there, about 14% of the U.S. citizens are immigrants, but about 20 to 25% of new businesses are started by immigrants, which is a very interesting statistic to me, that they're creating more jobs than the native-borns are creating. And that helps our economy to grow because the new jobs come from the new businesses. And also the cultural diversity gives us strength. The American Armed Forces know that diversity leads to better decision-making, and they are the sole groups that are maintaining that DEI, that diversity, equity, inclusion themes more than other corporations are right now, because they're convinced that that's going to allow their armed forces to make better decisions if they maintain diversity among their people. So this allows us to have better problem solving and better global connectivity if we're more involved with diverse populations, and we have a better system to include more people in everything that we do. Let's turn to the next group, which is the unauthorized. We've been talking about legal immigrants. All of those people were legal immigrants, all those visas were legal, and all those workarounds I mentioned, those were all legals. But we also know that we have some people who are unauthorized, or we could sometimes call them undocumented, people without the proper papers to live here legally. There are approximately 11 million people in the country who are living here, and that's been a pretty steady number throughout the last 10 years. Some people come, some people go, but by and large it's about 11 million. One of the interesting things I learned in doing this research was that half of those people have come from crossing the border, mostly the southern border, as you know, but some from the north border as well. But also half of those people are visa overstayers. Remember our students, remember our travelers, remember our temporary work people. Well, sometimes their visa might expire, but they might not leave. So right now, about half of those people in the country have crossed the border, and half of those people have overstayed their visa. And if you look at the second line, annually, when we see the new people that are coming in, only about a third of the people are crossing the border, and 2/3 are overstaying their visas. So we have a much bigger problem if we think these people are a problem with visa overstayers than border crossers. Just an interesting fact. The other thing is 66% of the people who are in this category, unauthorized, have been living in the States for over 10 years. There are lots of people who've been here more than 25 or 30 years. There are about 72% of this number are working age people. I didn't realize until I saw this statistic doing research for this talk, over 3 million people in that category own their own homes. So these are people who are making enough money to buy a home and have a mortgage and everything. And they are now, of course, because they've lived here a long time, they are the parents of at least 4 million U.S. citizen children. Or maybe they're the grandparents of citizen children. So that's the second group that we're going to talk about. Now let's turn and see what their contribution is. Unauthorized workers make up about 4.5% of our working population. So 4.5% of our workforce comes from this group, the unauthorized work. And this is, of course, the target we're going to be talking about when we think about mass deportation, this group right here. What do we know about them? We know that essential workers, that they are essential workers. We learned during COVID that these are the people that help us the most in agriculture. They help us in our health care, our construction industry, and our landscaping businesses have a lot of people of the unauthorized workforce. We also know statistically, the government tells us that these people have not only paid federal taxes in the amount of $59 billion and $37 billion to state and local taxes, but they are also they're contributing to our social benefits like Social Security and Medicare, even though they would never be eligible because they're not citizens. They will never draw Social Security and they will never draw Medicare. So that's a number we want to keep in mind too. If we lose these people, we lose those contributions. So let's turn and think about what's going to happen when we hear about mass deportation. What does that really mean? And what do we think is going to happen with the new Republican administration? we're going to go back to that list we looked at before, and we're going to think about what's going to actually happen to all these people. I think the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to start to slow down the way we present and vet our people for all these visas. So on the left-hand side, all those pathways to citizenship, all those million people a year that we used to bring in, I think we're going to just crank that right down, and we'll slow that right down so that we don't bring as many people in. Now on the humanitarian visas, the refugees is a number that's generally set by the president. And we know that in the last administration, Trump decided he would bring the refugee number right down to about 15,000. It's up now to about 125,000 refugees per year are being brought in the country. And so we would expect that that would drop right off. In a minute, we'll turn to look at what's going to happen to those asylum seekers at the border. We'll save that till the next page. The temporary work visas are interesting because there's been a little controversy in the news. I don't know if you've seen the newspaper recently about those H-1Bs. Now remember, the H-1Bs come in either as high-tech people or medical people, people with some technical expertise that we think we would like to have working for us, especially the tech companies. And what I've been watching recently is how the administration is starting to shape up. We have really 3 groups that are involved in the administration now, and those folks are starting to argue about things like this H-1B. So the MAGA folks, the people who really elected Trump, are the ones that are the most against immigrants of any sort, the legals or the unauthorized. And what they were saying about these H-1Bs is we didn't think we wanted to have those H-1Bs at all come into the country. These are people like Stephen Miller, who's going to be in the White House. Steve Bannon is not in the administration, but he is certainly somebody who's involved in discussing what should happen, and he's got a big following of his own. So that's kind of the MAGA crowd. We also know that in the administration there are a lot of folks sort of from the high industry groups, the financial groups, the hedge funds, and the investment bankers coming in to be as a part of the administration. Now, what they really want is they are pushing back against the MAGA folks because they just want the economy to run smoothly, right? That's their goal, and they want to make sure that the GDP grows and we don't have high inflation, and they just want sort of the economy to work smoothly. So they're a little bit at odds. But then this third group is kind of popping up, and that's the tech folks, the real high-tech folks like Elon Musk. And he was the one that came out recently, remember, in the news and said, I really want there to be more H-1Bs. And the MAGA folks said, well, we don't think there should really be any H-1Bs. And we'll see what happens. We'll see who wins that argument. I just was skimming an article this morning that Biden has just announced just this week some changes to the H-1B that'll make it easier to use them, and a little bit streamlining from the university into the H-1Bs, and more efficient renewals, that kind of thing. I don't know whether that'll continue on next week or not, but that H-1B is kind of an interesting one to watch, because then you can see the different groups and their attitudes. Now, the DACAs, remember, they have to renew every 2 to 3 years, and those are the young people, and a lot of them are, teachers, and they're doctors, and they're lawyers, and all kinds of people in that group, because they were allowed to go to school, and they were allowed to drive and have driver's license and work legally. So they've been able to progress, and they are at risk because it may just be decided that we don't want to have those people anymore. So it's possible that the 600,000 at some point will just expire individually, and they won't be allowed to renew, and then they'll be unauthorized. They do have a little halo around them. I have heard Trump say that he really thinks that the DACA people, we should keep them, And so it's hard to say really what's going to happen. But the temporary protected status and the humanitarian parole people, they too are sort of hanging in the balance, and they will all expire at different times, either individually in the case of humanitarian parole, or as temporary protected status as a group. They move them along in clumps of time, and they too may expire. Another thing that happened this week was that 4 different countries, their expiration dates were extended another 18 months. So that was an action that was taken this week before the inauguration. So that's what I think is going to happen with the legal immigrants. What's going to happen here at the border, in my opinion, is that Trump will reinitiate Title 42, which, as you recall, was basically an asylum ban at the border. Normally, it would be customary and legal for people to walk up to the port of entry and ask for asylum, just like some people could fly in. You may remember years ago, people who were tennis players or ballerinas or coming in either to play a game, or a basketball player would come to the U.S. on a temporary visa and ask for asylum. So this is what happens at the southern border, is people come in to the port of entry and ask for asylum. During COVID, this was all shut down, so no asylum requests were being accepted, and I would expect that would happen right away, that there would be no requests for asylum at the ports of entry. You'll hear the news next week if that comes up, but I think that'll come pretty quickly. There's also been a discussion of the soft-sided detention center along the border. One of the issues in the immigration system is the detention centers. We'll talk about them in a minute, but there isn't really enough, they talk about beds, there isn't really enough space or enough beds for as many people as they might need to detain if there's a mass deportation. So one of the thoughts was, well, we could put up more detention centers along the border, particularly in Texas, where apparently some land has been donated for this purpose, and that would be useful as a way to collect people and then to hold them in waiting for flights home to their home country if we decided to deport them. I would expect that we would have some technical parts of the asylum restricted. There would always be some capacity for some exceptions, even if we shut down the asylum system. But these are technical issues. Third country transit basically says if you haven't applied for asylum in a country that you traveled through, if let's say you're coming up from Honduras, but you had to travel through Guatemala and Mexico, if you haven't asked for asylum in those two countries, you shouldn't ask for it here. And I would expect that they might start that third country transit ban again. And also there was a discussion of a public charge rule, which basically said, if we think you're ever going to be in a position to need financial services from the U.S., we're not going to allow you in to the country at all. So that would be another way to restrict asylum. And then Remain in Mexico was a program that was used before. Normally, if you ask for asylum at the port of entry and you're allowed in because you have passed that initial credible fear test, you're allowed to come and wait for your court appointment where you talk to a judge while living in the U.S. And this Remain in Mexico basically said, no, we're going to make you live in northern Mexico while you wait for your day in court. So that, I would think, would be reinstated as well. For sure, what this is going to do is cut people off who are coming north and who are desperate. Most of the people who are in northern Mexico right now and waiting to ask for asylum are fleeing from some pretty desperate situations. They're not here by and large for goodwill or because they're trying to get a job. They're here because they're fleeing a situation in their home state in Mexico or in their home country or from around the world. And what happens when you cut off asylum like this, as we saw the first time, is that more people just decide they have to go through the desert and try to come here without the proper papers. They just will give up asking for asylum and they'll come anyway. And so for sure we'll see more deaths in the desert in this area. So this is quite a dense slide, but mass deportation preparations we'll go through pretty quickly. We've talked about the narratives that have been laying the groundwork, and we have heard about national security problems with public safety, how much at risk we are. We're also talking about non-cooperative jurisdictions will be punished. Now, this is talking about states or localities that are not cooperating with ICE. ICE is the main organization of the federal government that is charged with collecting people who are going to be detained or deported. So the question really becomes whether states and local jurisdictions will cooperate with ICE. We'll talk about how they can cooperate on a different slide. But suffices to say, in general, you can take two extremes. Texas, on the one hand, is more than willing to cooperate with ICE. They have local laws that say that they will cooperate with ICE, and what that means is that they are willing to ask people what their immigration status is if they stop them for a speeding ticket. They are willing to give ICE lists of people who are in their local jails. They are willing to hold those people longer in their local jails once their sentences have been served so that they can turn those people over to ICE. So that's Texas, and that's one extreme. Then you have California on the other extreme. They have laws that say just the opposite. They say, we are not going to cooperate with ICE, and we forbid any of our local jurisdictions to cooperate with ICE. So that means we are not going to pass along information. We are not going to ask anyone's immigration status if we stop them. We are not going to pass any names along to ICE, and we're certainly not going to hold people past there. So those are the sort of two extremes. And of course, the rhetoric is we are going to punish the Californias, the states that act like California, if they're unwilling to cooperate with us. We'll see how that plays out. Those three numbers there are really what needs to happen and to be set up, and you're hearing things and reading things in the news. How are we setting up to be able to do mass deportation? One, of course, you need money, you need manpower, and you need infrastructure. So the money, we're already in discussions about the budget, and we're talking about how much money is needed and how much will this cost. And already the border czar, Tom Homans, is saying, I don't have enough money to really do this big deportation that we had been talking about because I just don't have enough money to do it. So he's already starting to come down on the thought that he could actually get rid of 11 million people. Manpower. ICE has only about 6,000 people who are charged with actually doing this function of researching who's out there and collecting them and detaining them and then deporting them. I mean, this takes a lot of time and effort. So we only have 6,000 people. So what are we going to do? Well, could we get other people to help us to do this? How can we get more manpower, say, from the National Guard or from the Department of Defense? How could we get more people to help on the ICE side of things? So that's also in discussions. The third is infrastructure. We don't really have enough capacity to detain people and then deport people. So already in discussions, we are talking to people who our detention is organized by private sector for-profit organizations. The Geo Group and Core Civic are the two large ones. But also the local jails sometimes get involved holding people, and they're paid by the federal government to hold people. We also have deportation flights. We have some 50 to 60 flights a month going all over the world. Well, are there more planes that can do this? Are there more ways we can get more planes? We don't know. And then foreign countries need to be involved in this. Who's going to take these people? For example, we don't have diplomatic relations with Cuba. We don't have diplomatic relations with Venezuela or Haiti. So where can we go with those people? We can't deport them home, but I know I've been reading that We've been having discussions with people like Guatemala who've said, well, we'll take those third country people. If you want to deport them, we'll take them into our country. So all these discussions are going on. So all this prep is definitely in the works. How is this going to happen? What can we expect on day one? I would expect a lot of executive orders and a lot of DHS policy statements to come out right out of the gate next week. I think we're going to see a flood of these. Among them, I think we're going to first say, let's expand the deportation targets from the violent criminal to all people who are here unauthorized. I think we could say, let's expand our ability to use expedited removals. Expedited removals were generally used here at the border for people who'd only been here a very short time and they were still here at the border, so we could turn them right back across the border in Mexico. And if we expanded that to the whole country and didn't say it had to be within a short period of time, we could pick up a lot more people. We could restrict what's called prosecutorial discretion. Now, this is a term. Let's take an example of somebody who's here. Let's say Bernardo is here from Mexico, and he's unauthorized, and he's married to Jane, and she's an American. And they have 3 children, and they're all American citizens, but one child is quite ill, so that means Jane has to stay home with that child, can't work. Bernardo, though, he's done very well for himself, and he has his own construction business, and he's hired 8 workers. And so he works full-time construction in that business, 8 workers. Now, let's deport Bernardo. Well, we could deport Bernardo, but in the past, we might have used this term here, prosecutorial discretion, that it would be very difficult for this American child who's ill, who needs the mother at home, and so she can't work, and really needs the income from Bernardo. So we're going to give Bernardo a pass on being deported. We're going to use our prosecutorial discretion to keep him in the country. And he's got that little pass card on his record. Next week, we might just take that away and say, well, so we're not going to let him have that process. We're not going to allow that to continue. So that's one option. And also mandatory detention. We use a lot of judgment here whether somebody is at risk or whether somebody is at risk or somebody is okay. We can send people to detention, but we can also have them use alternatives to detention, which is oftentimes, hang on one second, or let's hold off here. We've got just a little emergency here in the church. We're going to take care of it. Okay, we're talking about what could happen on day 1 next week. And we were up to mandatory detention. And again, there is some judgment that's used by the judges and other folks in the immigration system whether we want to send somebody into detention, and detention is really a euphemism for prison. It's a nice word to say we're going to put you in a prison, and limit what was called alternatives to detention. There are other ways that we can keep track of people even though they may not be in full-time detention. We have ankle monitors, for example, who are put on people so we can watch their movement. We have ICE check-ins, which is a way to get people to come on a, say, monthly or bi-weekly basis to an office just to check in to make sure that they're still in the area. There's eye recognition technology through phones. So there's a number of ways that we can keep track of people, but we don't have to send them to detention. But again, it may be announced we're not going to use those alternatives to detention anymore. We're going to have mandatory detention. I have a feeling we're going to have a national emergency declared. There's been some discussion of invoking the Alien Enemies Act, which you all know was last invoked in World War II when we rounded up the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians here in the U.S. And again, keep in mind those soft-sided tents down in Texas that they're constructing. They would be very useful to round people up. We might say, we are being invaded by Mexicans, and so we need to invoke this Alien Enemies Act. I was on a conference call a few weeks ago talking about whether people thought this was legal or not, and the judgment was that the general consensus was that it would not be something that could be used in this instance, but it doesn't mean that it won't be used. So we'll have to see. And then I think we're going to see a lot of National Guard headed to the border, just a big show of strength at the border, because the border really is the flashpoint for these discussions and where we see the invasions, et cetera. And we're going to see showcase raids, I think, in D.C. or other areas, meaning they're going to pick a few spots. We've already read the news where in Bakersfield, California, there was a raid. I read this morning that they had picked up 179 people throughout the area. That was not ICE, that was Border Patrol. Border Patrol generally polices along the border between the ports of entry, but in this case they moved inland, and they by law are at least allowed to go 100 miles from the border or from the Pacific Ocean. So Bakersfield would be in that area, and they were the ones that conducted the raid. So it'll be interesting to see how they decide to use both ICE and Border Patrol for rounding up people, but they definitely, next week we will see raids throughout the country. Okay, so who are these people who are going to be rounded up? We talked a little bit about criminals earlier. 70% of the people who are in ICE detention or ICE custody come out of the local jails, and we talked about this before. Local jails are generally managed by the sheriffs in each local county. Every county has a sheriff. Generally, 85% of the sheriffs are elected. They're not appointed officials, they're elected officials, and so they run the local jails. So again, it comes down to these local sheriffs whether or not they are interested in working with ICE. There's an interesting case right now in San Diego. California, as you recall, has a law that says local jurisdictions cannot cooperate with ICE and hand over people once they've terminated their sentences, once they've completed their sentences in the local jail. Let's say they were driving without a license and they were thrown in jail for 2 days. Well, they could be held in order to be given to ICE. So in California, the state law says our local jurisdictions cannot cooperate. The local sheriff in San Diego County says, I don't agree with that law, and I'm a bigger authority here in this county than what you can tell me to do. So I'm going to go ahead and still use my judgment as to whether I want to cooperate with ICE or not. And so the local council of San Diego had a discussion, and they too voted, we are not going to cooperate with ICE, and we forbid anybody in our locality to cooperate with ICE. And still the sheriff said, that's okay, I'm sort of an independent actor here, and I'm going to continue working. So this is going to come down to lawsuits between the San Diego City Council and the local sheriff as to whether she can decide on her own whether to cooperate with ICE or not. And cooperating with ICE means I'm just going to hand this information over without a judicial warrant. If ICE gets a judicial warrant, then you can't really argue with it. But oftentimes they just say, well, we have the papers here that say we can pick this person up, but there's no judge involved. So let's get onto that second line, which is what is a criminal? When we say criminals, we need to ask ourselves, well, what kind of criminal are we talking about here? Because we have violent criminals, and I think it's pretty well understood that most would agree we don't really want to keep violent criminals in our country. We'd be fine if the violent criminals were to be taken out. But to say all criminals, now that's where we start to get into splitting hairs here. Border crossers if you were to cross between the ports of entry, that would be a federal criminal misdemeanor, and you would be a criminal if you did that. So anybody that crossed the border here between the ports of entry is a federal criminal, according to our laws. It's an unusual law, though, by the way. I've looked up other countries. They don't generally have a criminal, it's not a criminal act to cross between the ports of entry. It would just be a civil act. It wouldn't be a criminal act. And then we have traffic violations. Now, you know, a lot of states don't even allow the unauthorized to get driver's licenses. So to say, well, you have a traffic violation, that could just mean driving without a driver's license. So when you say we're going to go after just the criminals, when the federal government says that to us, they mean all these people. And so other people are saying, well, let's be sure we understand who we're talking about, because most of the people who are in ICE detention their violation is traffic violations. That's the majority of the people who are criminals. Some people have final deportation orders by a judge. Some people have already been told, you know, you came in under the asylum request, you went through the process, you got in front of the judge, but you didn't qualify, and you need to leave. And they didn't leave. So they might be a target of these mass deportations. And then the people who take ICE check-ins. It wouldn't surprise me that people who were doing ICE check-ins, say once a month, would then be picked up. How are we going to get large numbers here quickly? These are the people that we look for. And then we talked about the expedited removals, those people that can be removed without even talking to a judge. If we could create more of those, then we would target those people. And then cancellation of removals. Some people, like our friend Bernardo, might have been told, you now have a cancellation of removal, meaning you can't be removed. You're not here as a documented person, you're not a citizen, no pathway to citizenship, but you have had a cancellation, we're going to reverse that, and so we're going to see a lot of these possibilities as time goes on. Oh, let me just back up one before I go on. The million-dollar question I'm asked, and we really don't have an answer for, is how many people are going to be deported? Now, we know the high is 11 million, right? That's like if we did the most, they could take out 4.5% of our workforce. That would be devastating to our economy for sure. I think what we have to think of is what's been the high and the low. So this past year, Biden deported about 275,000. That was in a typical year. That was a pretty high number. That was the highest since Obama in 2014. His high was 400,000. So the question is, what are we expecting for mass deportation? Remember, Homans, who's the border czar, he's already trying to set the expectation. I don't have the money, the flights, we don't have detention beds. There's a lot I don't have here. If I don't have any money, I can't ramp up quickly. I think if he were to do more than 500,000, it would be a lot in the year, but it almost doesn't matter how many the number is, because to those 500,000, it's going to be a very traumatic event, and it's going to be noticeable. So I'm thinking if they do 500,000 this year, unless they get heroic on the money and they really start cranking up the infrastructure and all that, maybe they could do 1 million. We just don't know. We'll see. I'm sure they'll be telling us, or they'll be telling us numbers that, maybe aren't so true. What do you think the consequences of the deportations are? I think you're going to know these people. I think it's going to affect a lot of Americans more than they realize. I think that your grandchildren are going to come home one day and they're going to say, I can't believe it, but Susie's in my class and her mother was deported. I had no idea that her mother was unauthorized, but she's been deported. And I think that the kids in the schools are going to see this a lot, because I think there are an awful lot more unauthorized people throughout the country than we realize. And I think for us, if we have parents who are being cared for, they're going to be affected, because that would be a great place for a raid, a workplace where you think there's a lot of unauthorized people. Construction sites, 50% of Texas construction is unauthorized workers. So you start taking people out of that pool, and all their construction is going to slow right down. And landscaping, even around here, landscaping. These are the sort of the overgeneralizing, but this is where we're going to see the effect, I think, in our lives. Families will be separated. Families for sure are going to be separated. And that's devastating. There are reports that say when a child is separated from their parent in this manner, they just never get over it. So psychologically, there'll be a lot of damage. And of course, the thing that people don't think about too much is that there's going to be less focus on removing violent criminals the minute you dilute this and say, we're just going to take anybody that we can. It says, okay, ICE is not going to focus on the violent criminals. I would just assume that they worked on the violent criminals personally, but that's going to be sort of thrown by the wayside. So in addition, of course, economic impacts. We're going to see some American jobs. There was a study that was done by a professor recently. She said for every million people that are removed, there will be about 44,000 American jobs lost, because all those people need supervisors, or there are workers of people who are starting businesses. So one or the other, it's going to affect the American workers if we start taking workers out of our economy. Fewer taxes will be paid, fewer Social Security payments will be made, fewer consumers to buy things. Businesses will go under because some businesses are completely dependent on these people who are unauthorized. And then, of course, the other place we'll see it is, of course, in our agriculture and our food. We're going to see, just like we did in COVID, we're going to have no availability or higher prices with things. So I think we're going to see that on the work side, in the elder care piece of it, but we're also going to see it economically. And again, it remains to be seen how this plays out. Remember, there's a part of the new administration which is very interested in making sure that the economy continues to run smoothly for this country. But there are other people who are really hell-bent on making sure that we get rid of as many immigrants as possible. It'll be interesting to see, as those groups argue among themselves, what actually wins out here and what happens at the end of the day. So why don't I stop there and open it up for your questions, and we'll see where this goes. I'll leave this slide up for those of you who want to learn more, and there's my email in case anybody needs to get in touch with me later.
Okay, and Alyson, after everybody asks the question, can you please repeat the question?
Sure.
Especially for our Zoom participants, because I don't know if they can hear everything here.
Hi, I was just wondering about the situations that may come down the road where, families, maybe mom or dad is here without papers. The children were born here, but there's been a lot of noise about, well, we'll just deport everybody. I mean, how is that legal to deport an American citizen?
Yeah, so the question is, if a family is what they call mixed status, there are some folks who are unauthorized to be here, and others are say the children are American citizens because they've been born here. How is it legal that they could be deported? There's been a lot of talk about, well, we'll just take the whole family. We won't separate the families, we'll just take the whole family. There's already been one case in Texas where this has happened, where they have deported the mother who was unauthorized with, I think, 3 or 4 of her kids, 3 of whom were American citizens, and the other who wasn't. I don't think it is legal. I don't think that's going to stop this administration from doing things that are illegal. I don't think that's going to stop them, and they'll fight it out in the courts. Mm-hmm.
Oh, and also, can I ask you, when you ask a question, if you could just state your name and where you're from? Okay. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Judy, and I'm from Green Valley. Many of us have worked with people where we could keep them safe. I'm worried about raids in hospitals, churches. And what do you think and I hear talk about that.
Yes.
Are they going to be able to do that?
The question has to do with raids in churches and schools. It's very likely, because there has been sort of a moratorium on ICE going into churches where there may be people living in sanctuary, or schools, or courts, or hospitals. My understanding is that there's talk that this new administration will roll back those restrictions on ICE. But right now, throughout the country, schools and hospitals and all kinds of businesses are creating new policies and new procedures that basically say, we will only allow you in if you have a court order that's signed by a judge. So I think there's a whole bunch of training that's going on throughout the country to allow people to understand they don't just have to let ICE come in, but they do if there's a court order signed by a judge. Just like they couldn't come into your home without the court order, and the unauthorized are being taught the same thing, that they too have rights, and that they do not need to allow anyone into their home unless they can see a court order signed by a judge with the name of the person that they're looking for. So that's the defense against this change that we're going to see, is training in a new policy and having people understand what that policy is. There's no, you can't prevent them if they have the right papers. I mean, legally, you can't prevent them from coming in. But they have to go through the steps to get the court order signed by the judge. Yeah, thanks.
We're going to, after this question, we're kind of go back and forth.
I'm Jim Wise. I'm from the Twin Cities in Minnesota. We have a 50-year-old federal set of laws to handle immigration, and they've needed to be updated for 50 years, essentially. And yet nobody in the Senate or House, well, they'd rather pass around Arizona rattlesnakes than even mention immigration. What is the thinking behind the feds that they will do nothing to take care of the problem?
I wish I knew. What's behind the thinking of the Congress that they're doing nothing about the immigration laws? I think it's such a hot topic that they're afraid to get involved. And it's become this narrative that people feel that in order to get elected, they need to go along with the narrative which says that immigrants are bad. There was a huge swing in the last year of attitudes and opinions in this country because of the election. And it plays well with the American public, this kind of rhetoric. So I just think people are afraid to make a change that's going to be unpopular. And it seems over the last 10 or 20 years, we've always set up this if-then. We've said, well, we need more border security, is one side saying we need more border security, and the other side saying, well, we need to make more pathways to citizenship for all these people who are here. And it seems like the border security and increasing money for the border security wins out in that argument, and this other side doesn't get moved in any positive way. That's just my opinion.
Somebody on the side?
My name is Ted, and I'm from Green Valley, and my question is, how much power is there in the legal system to delay the implementation of questionable executive power decision things? How much can we trip it up and slow it down?
How much ability do we have to delay an executive decision? Not very much at all. There are some procedures which require like 30 days notice and comments, but an executive order from the president doesn't really require any input from other folks. It might be deemed illegal. It could be brought up in the courts, and we could have that process go on a lot, which I think we'll see. But he can make his decisions whatever he wants. And I think we're going to see a lot coming out early next week.
Thank you, Alyson. I'm Guy Nelson, and is there potentially there? It's to me, and I'm an optimist, so I may not know what's going on. The fact that Donald Trump changed his mind a bit on the H-1B visas, is there some spillover perhaps into the other areas of visas, like for you mentioned the loss of jobs in the agricultural business? Well, is somebody whispering in his ear, like Musk whispered in his ear, about that kind of loss?
Is there some chance that the president will not go along with some of the things he's been saying he's going to do, or because he's kind of waffling on the H-1B? And I think he's less opinionated about this issue than he talks, and I think he changes his mind and says one thing one day and one thing another day, and I think it is an argument. I think those H-1Bs have a lot more support than the agricultural workers do, but the agricultural workers are going to hit the consumers in the pocketbook more if the prices go up. So it's not going to be easy for him to decide how to do this, and he may not be the one to decide. I think that we'll see what happens. There's going to be push and pull on both sides. There's going to be people saying, look, we need these workers to get these products to market, and then there's going to be people saying we need to get rid of them. We'll see who wins the battle.
Thank you. Excuse me. My name is Nanaki from Green Valley. What happens to the countries that these immigrants came from? Is there any pushback that they can have as far as all of a sudden a whole bunch of people coming back? Can they protest? Can they refuse them?
Okay, is there pushback from the countries who are accepting the people? I think the big differentiator would be if we have diplomatic relations with them, then they're going to sort of do what we tell them to do, frankly. We have a lot of clout as a country. The ones where we have problems are the countries where we don't have diplomatic relations, but as I said, they're already talking with other countries, third-party countries, who can take these people because we don't want to keep them here. So that will be a play. But basically, a country has to accept its own citizens back if they're being sent. They can't refuse them. So I do know it's just interesting when you read all this that the Mexicans, this new president Sheinbaum, is pushing back a little bit more than they have in the past, and Mexico, all these Central American countries, because of the remittances from the people who live here, they are sometimes 18 or 20% of their GDP. This is huge money for these countries. And so they love the fact that there are people here in the States earning money and sending money back to their countries. They talk about the Mexicans who are here as their heroes. So there's a whole different attitude there about what's going to happen here and protecting them and that kind of thing. We have a lot of power in this hemisphere. We may be not having as much power in other parts of the world, but here we still hold a lot of power.
Hi, my name is Melissa. I'm from Green Valley. I'm interested in some issues at the local level. Back in 2016, when Trump came into office, I worked in another county in another state, and we did trainings for people to help them know their rights. I don't know if that seems naive at this point, or whether there are any organizations locally that are doing that.
Yes, yes. All over the country, we are, the question is, in the first Trump administration, there were Know Your Rights trainings for people who were unauthorized. And believe me, there are these trainings going on all over the country now for people to know their rights, to know if I'm in my car and I'm stopped by ICE or Border Patrol, what are my rights? What do I have to say? What don't I have to say? If I'm in my home and ICE knocks on the door, what can I do? I need to see the warrant signed by the judge with my name on. No, I don't have to open the door. Show me the warrant. You know, these things are not easy to do if the police is knocking on your door, but there are trainings going on right now for this. And also, the other part of the training that's going on talks about family planning. What would happen to my children if I'm deported? What would happen to the car that I just bought that I still owe money on? Am I going to default on that loan, or is somebody going to pay that off for me? Who has power of attorney? Who's going to take my children? So there's that kind of training and coaching going on as well.
What about Sharon Proctor, Green Valley? What about the asylum seekers for the last few years that have paperwork and waiting for their court date? Is there any way those could be reversed?
What about the people who are here? Good question. They've come, they've presented themselves, they're in the process of waiting for their court date. I believe they could be at risk. I don't know for sure, but I believe they could be at risk.
Hi, Alyson. A gentleman we met at the wall, American citizen, left the U.S., went to Nogales, and got his wife and daughter, and they came through the desert around the wall. What's going to happen to him? I'm sure she was deported. You know, Border Patrol, they turned themselves in.
Right.
Is he in real big trouble because he didn't?
I think he could be. The question is, an American citizen who had a wife who was unauthorized came through the desert between the ports of entry. As I said earlier, it is illegal for any of us, including this American citizen, to cross the border between the ports of entry and not declare ourselves. I think it would depend on the mood of the Border Patrol person on the day that this happened, whether they just read him the riot act, whether they, charge him with illegal entry, which would be a misdemeanor. As you know, in Tucson, the courts hear these cases all the time of people who've come between the ports of entry. And I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, so I really don't know what would happen.
Hi, thank you so much. Your slides have been really helpful to go through. And my question, I'm Kathy from Green Valley, and my question is, one of the slides said that there were 3 million undocumented that owned their own homes or property.
Right.
What happens to that property if they are then removed?
Yes, it's a good question. What happens to their property if they're removed? It's a good question. I think that's what we're trying to help people prepare for with these trainings, right? The training says, okay, if you have an asset, is that going to be transferred to your aunt or your whatever? I mean, you've got to make a decision as you would in a state. What if you are deported and you can no longer be in the country? What's going to happen to those assets? I think it depends on the individual situation in that family. What would the choice be for these assets? I mean, you might have a friend who could sell it for you and you could take the money. There'd be a lot of things you could do, but you'd have to decide that for yourself.
There's also car loans.
Car
Someone brought
loans,
that up
yes.
to me the other day, all the folks that have car loans, you know, that, yeah. So.
Hi, my name is Doris. I'm visiting from Berlin, Germany. Migration is a global problem, and governments come and go and make decisions this way, and next time they make the decisions the other way. What I would like to know, if you have any information on sharing of best practices amongst NGOs internationally, or are NGOs also as fractured as governments? They come and go and make different decisions in different countries. Or is there a network of NGOs that share best practices with regards to border issues?
For border issues. The place that I would go is on that list that you're looking at. The Migration Policy Institute is in Washington, but it is an international organization. And they would be the place I would start with best practices. I know another organization that's called the Mayor's Migration Council. Now they're not, you're talking about actual laws, right? Or are you talking about best practices for assimilating new immigrants?
Yeah, not law, best practices.
Best practices, yeah. I go to the Mayor's Migration Council as well because they focus not on the country level, but on the city level, because that's where most of the migrants end up. And they have a lot of programs and projects that focus on best practices for integrating. Thanks. Any other questions? We
can take probably one or two more, Alyson.
Okay.
All right, we got two up here.
Okay.
One on the right and one on the left.
Okay. Thank you all for staying, but you're more than welcome to head out if you've had enough.
Hi, I'm Barb Lemon, and I know that in the last Trump administration, when he invoked Title 42, what happened was on the southern side of the wall, camps sprung up with people waiting that were forced to wait on the other side before they could see the court. Now we're talking about gathering people up here, put them in detention, and then fly them home. But there will still be people coming from the south.
Right.
Do you anticipate also we'll have tents along the border?
Yes, what's going to happen, Barb's question basically said, look, it's just because we have a law that says you can't enter the country doesn't mean people aren't going to keep coming, right? Because they hear rumors, they think that the border's still open, or I can get through somehow, or my coyote tells me it's possible, and they can, if you just pay enough money, you can get through. So what we saw the last time was people building up along the northern part of Mexico in the shelters or living on the street because there wasn't enough room in the shelters. Yes, I think this will happen again. I also did read an article the other day that said Mexico was anticipating building more shelters along the northern border in anticipation of this. But of course, we have yet to be seen what the numbers look like and how that will play out. In any event, it's a very, very risky situation for these people who are fleeing, and they're at risk and vulnerable anyway, to then be in northern Mexico when some of these people come in from Guatemala or other countries. They don't speak English, they don't speak Spanish, and they have to somehow live and get advice as to what they can do. So I think we're going to see horrific needs on both sides of the border, but it'll swing back to Mexico more than in country.
We'll take this one and this one, and I think I'll wrap it up.
Okay.
Hi, Cindy from Green Valley. And you may not be able to answer this because you're not an attorney, but I was wondering for those, like say I had a caretaker who was undocumented and ICE came to my home and that person was there. I'm just wondering what my liabilities would be when I tell them to go away and come back with a warrant, and I mean just that kind of situation.
Yes, I'm not. The question is, if I'm in my home as an American citizen and my caretaker or my caregiver comes to visit me, or my cleaning lady or whatever, and I know they're unauthorized, and ICE comes to the door. Is that your scenario? ICE comes to the door. Well, they really have no right to enter your home, just like police they have no right to enter your home, unless they have a judge's warrant signed with that person's name. I'm looking for that person, not just I want to come in and look around. So you have every right to tell them, no, I'm not letting you in, I'm not opening the door. You come back with a judge's warrant, and that's that. Mm-hmm.
You didn't think you'd get away without me asking a question. Jim Brustar, or Jaime Brustar. I'm working 19, almost 20 years on the border with the Samaritans and the Keno Border Initiative. Ever since I've started, we had deportees coming across and come to the Keno for meals and services. After all the new translations of the law for admission, et cetera, people coming across, we're seeing fewer people. Last year, a year and a half ago, we had maybe 400 to 500 people a day coming for services. Casa Alitas was started during that period of time as well, seeing a lot of people. Now, as of yesterday, I think we had maybe 50 people. So the numbers have gone down. But my expectation is the numbers are going to go up to the hundreds. And we'll get to the point where we used to see 400, 500, 600, 700 people a day looking for services.
Oh, that was not a question, Jaime. So, yeah, that was a speech. But what Jaime said, you all heard it here, I think, in the room, but for the people, if there's anybody left on Zoom, the comment was that at Keno, which is just south of here in Nogales, on the Mexican side, there's a shelter. And in the last Republican administration, there were several hundred a day, 700, 800 a day coming in, because this Title 42 basically says we're going to rapidly expel you if you come across because we're afraid you might have COVID. But what that meant was just people would try 2 and 3 times to cross the border. So there a lot of people were congested right there in the northern Mexico area coming to this shelter. Now the numbers are down. The numbers are down because Mexico, we leaned on Mexico very heavily during the election period and during the campaigns, because we wanted to clean up the border during the elections. So we put a lot of pressure on Mexico to stop those people from getting as far north as they had been before. But we would expect, yes, I would agree with you, we would expect these numbers to go back up if Title 42 or some other mechanism doesn't allow us to take asylum requests at the border. We'll see more in that northern Mexico. It's the same comment as what Barb made. That's right. Thank you all for coming and for listening and being interested. It's the main thing. Be interested.